Hello and welcome back to Poddinham Podspur, the world's only and therefore best Tottenham Hotspur podcast about Tottenham Hotspur podcasts. I'm Ian and I'm just talking to you today in the wake of the disastrous 1-0 loss that Tottenham suffered against Sunderland on the weekend. Unfortunately, that ruined what was otherwise a pretty good weekend for me. I went out to see a minor league baseball game with my wife and kid. Had a pretty good time. The Maryland Bay Sox out in Bowie, which is a fun word to say. Say it with me now, Bowie. And had a nice time at our local Moco Spurs watch party. Other than the result, I have to say I spent a significant portion of the second half of my head in my hands. It was a pretty bad time. I think a lot of folks that's underplaying it, isn't it? I think it was a pretty bad time. A lot of folks were very hopeful, myself included, that Roberto De Zerbi could come in and make some meaningful change. And we heard that wonderful word, green shoots, again for the 50th time this season, that there was some improvement in play. No real patterns, but there was some drive. I think in that first half, we actually saw some intent to score a goal. So maybe there was some, but in the end, we were undone by the same old story, a little microcosm of our season. Injuries, luck, refereeing questions, manager questions, punditry questions. So, I'm going to get into that today. I'm going to get into all of those sort of myths and conversations that have built up this season about why Tottenham are where they are this season. And before I get into that, I just want to thank people for the quite overwhelming, in some ways, response to my Roberto De Zerbi. I'm going to leave that in because Roberto De Zerbi is a pretty funny mispronunciation. My Roberto De Zerbi podcast last week, all about the fan reaction to him coming on board. Some of you shared your stories with me privately and they were moving. Other people disagreed with what I said, and thank you for sharing that too, because I think that holding ourselves accountable and doing kind of a self-scan of where we're at and the decisions we make is valuable, as I said in the pod last week. So thank you. I think people shared it online on Blue Sky. Thank you for doing that. You can find the pod online at podinhampodspur.bsky.social over there on Blue Sky. I'm nowhere else because I'm useless at marketing this podcast. So it was heartening to see. So thank you for that. I wanted to put out something which was measured amongst a lot of immediate reactions from people, and I think that's a valuable way to go about sharing your thoughts on this podcast, platforms and etc. So other people to do that. I feel like my position in general as a podcaster is to take a step back and think about things a little more deeply. Try not to wade in, and in that case, there were definitely some of my own personal biases that came into play. But that's going to happen. I'm not a robot, right? I'm not a ChatGPT Ian or something, as far as you know. So let's do some more of that today. Some more of my biases are going to come into play as I react to some of these theories that have been bandied around all season by numerous parties about why Tottenham are in kind of such an awful state. And I'll be honest, the structure of this podcast today was inspired a little bit by the Game is About Glory's structure last week, where they were talking about identifying the five sort of biggest mistakes that Spurs have made since the Europa League final. I felt like the measured breakdown of topics was really helpful for clarity, but also giving each one some space and time. So I'm going to do that today. The most common causes of our situations I've heard, all of which, incidentally and handily for me, were referenced in, I think it was Monday's, or maybe Sunday's Last Word on Spurs, in which Ricky Sachs, Billy T, Richard Cracknell, and Marcus Buckland talked about the Sunderland game, and they all indirectly, not purposefully, mentioned these things that have been bubbling around in the background. Their effect on the season, their effect on the players, their effect on the fans. And just to give a quick overview of these topics and just to see if you want to keep listening to this, it's the luck that we've suffered, good and bad, mostly the latter. The injuries that we've seen across the squad, refereeing inconsistencies and decisions, public perception of Tottenham Hotspur and how that can be controlled and, well, at the very least, influenced by the media. Confidence, player quality and squad construction, player leadership, fans, and finally I'm going to talk about club leadership, as I seem to every single week. So that first topic was luck. And I'm not going to go, one by one about who mentioned these, because I feel like, A, that's kind of boring for you to hear me just repeat names again and again, which I tend to do in other pods. But I'm just going to go through them one by one. And yeah, I'll drop a link to this podcast, the Last Word on Spurs pod, in my show notes. So the first one is luck. And in the Sunderland game, what we saw was obviously a deflected goal, which decided the match. And, this is, again, representative of the entire season. We've seen worldies scored against us. You can call it luck, call it misfortune, and this is almost a little gross of me to say so, but literally we had a manager whose father died halfway through a game. We had Tony Kinski falling over 20 times against Atletico Madrid a few weeks back. I'm probably missing something, but yeah, there's definitely been some bad luck that's befallen Spurs this year. Regarding some of the play, like the goals scored against us, I will point out that Ricky on Last One on Spurs pointed out that a major issue is positioning and defending, and we saw Gallagher kind of tracking back and not doing a good job defensively for their goal. And this has been a thing all season. We mentioned a lot. My friend Jared has been complaining about Thomas Frank and his, setup and allowing those shots from outside the box. And to a certain extent, with the quality of the Premier League nowadays, if you invite players onto you to take a pot shot from distance, they're going to do so. It's a bit like, was it like 3-pointers in basketball, where people are shooting further and further away because they're getting better and better at doing so, and that's changing the game. What Spurs haven't done is has moved with the times in that regard and set themselves up to both, limit the chances inside the box, right, which is what encourages these long shots, whilst also having either a goalkeeper who excels at those shots from distance, or just our defenders being cognizant of how to position their body to block them, which admittedly Mickey did, but just in a way that ended up being unlucky. But I don't think that was true of the goals earlier in the season. And yeah, I think that you could say that luck is, a part of why we are where we are. We lost a game because of it on the weekend. Those 3 points would have been incredibly valuable for kickstarting our season. But I think that to a certain extent, every team is unlucky. And this is going to be true of most of the things I talk about here. But every team is unlucky. You make your own luck, good and bad. You get good luck if you spend your time up in the opponent's box doing things that, cause the opponent to make a mistake. You make your own luck by being bad too, and in teams being able to be invited onto you and sensing blood in the water and taking those shots from distance. But we have no balance. Our team isn't good enough to offset the bad luck. These would be annoyances in other seasons. They might be the difference between 4th and 5th maybe. But we're not scoring goals up the other end in sufficient quantities or at the right time in games. So this is, making us desperate, and that desperation is both in players and in fan perception making the situation worse. I think that this is an interesting place to start off with because it's the one that we have the most intangible control over. Like I said, you can make your own luck, but by its definition, luck is just going to happen, and there's going to be variance in how that luck ebbs and flows across the season, across teams, between seasons. So it's a kind of an interesting concept for fans to latch onto as an explanation. It's almost like blaming the gods for what's happened to Spurs. The second topic was injuries. Injuries. And I mean, I don't have a list of the players, but what have we seen? Like, Kudus is just now out, for the rest of the season. Cudi Romero is probably out for the rest of the season. We've seen Odebear go down. We've seen Bentancur go down. We've seen Berraval go down. And it's gone back a few years now that these injuries have been befalling our team. And I think this is a substantial, probably, number one or number two in terms of on-pitch stuff. Well, stuff that you can see directly on the pitch that has contributed to where we are. You don't have your best players. James Maddison, Dejan Kulusevski, Mo Kudus, Christian Romero, these are our best players. Even Berraval, who was our player of the season last year, admittedly, in my opinion, just because there was a lack of candidates otherwise. And yeah, you don't put your best players on the pitch. What can you do? You're working with an arm tied behind your back. But what I found interesting this year, or this season about the injuries, has been the conspiracy theories that have popped up. We heard Scott Munn in the press recently talking about how he knew something was bad behind the scenes at Tottenham, and he had a solution, but he had pushback from leadership. It's all very well. It's like me saying, like, oh yeah, I know I know everything. I know all the solutions, but nobody would listen to me. Like, I don't think that's necessarily a compelling argument. Maybe he did, but without saying it, and maybe he's got like a non-disclosure agreement on him and he can't talk explicitly about what happened, but without him saying it was, an insufficient number of trainers at the club. They didn't have enough power, the medical staff, to push back on coaches. As we saw in the Amazon documentary a few years ago, the tension between the medical staff and Jose Mourinho trying to get players back on the field. I'll touch upon the kind of strangest conspiracy theory in a second, but without him divulging that information, it's just hot air, in my opinion. The injuries as well, I think that there's an underappreciated aspect is that I haven't got the data on this, so I'm feeding into this this mill of content. But I feel like if you get one injury in a player, and I think I heard Nathan A. Clark talk about this on the Extra Inch a while back. If you get one injury, that's the biggest predictor of a player suffering a second injury, right? So prior injury is the biggest, predictor of a recurrence or whatever, or like a new injury elsewhere in the body because of the way you compensate, I guess, or that muscle being strained. And that makes sense on an individual level, and we've seen that with Wilson Odebear, with James Maddison, with Rodrigo Bentancur, others. But I feel like that is also impacting the squad as a whole. You get one injury, I feel like you're more likely to get two because you're missing a player in that position. So you have to overplay, the backup or another person in that position. Like we've seen Jed Spence be pushed all over the field to compensate. Again, I'll get onto squad composition in a few minutes. The strangest conspiracy theory that I've heard about our injury situation is our pitch at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, but also at our training ground. Now, understandably, these are supposed to mirror each other as closely as possible to kind of increase that home field advantage that you have. The feel of the turf underneath your foot should be as close between the two of them. For consistency and players. But what fans are claiming is that there's the depth of the field at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is not sufficient, and it's harder because of that. There's this retractable pitch that's got like a steel tray that sustains the field itself, and there's like a layer of sports sand, and then obviously the I don't know, was it topsoil? I don't know if you can just get that from your local DIY store, but whatever it is. And it's also meshed in with artificial fibers because as we've seen in certain fields, they can turn into like an old school rugby field, where it's all chopped up and messy. So to sustain the impact and use of people walking around and running around with basically like knives on their attached to their feet in these football boots they wear, they have to be hardy. It has to be like a certain type of grass, has to be sustained a certain way, and it has to be supported by artificial grass. Now, artificial grass or artificial turf has like a very bad reputation in sport, going back to like the perception of the fields at the 1994 World Cup in USA, where people were, rightfully to a certain extent in that case, turning their nose up at it. There is like limited data on whether or not it increases injuries, but there is this like issue of hardness. What I'll say about the Spurs field is that I haven't heard any turf experts or any sports science experts on a Spurs podcast talking about this. Maybe somebody has behind the scenes, but I haven't heard anybody. It seems to be a lot of conjecture from podcasters and spreading of that of those theories from online or to Twitter or wherever. And I don't buy it. Frankly, I don't buy it. First of all, the field itself, the depth of it is like the meaningful sort of part of the field that you run on is so small. Even if other Premier League fields were like completely natural all the way down to the magma below the crust of the earth, it would still be so compacted and hard, with bedrock and all that other stuff. I don't think it makes a meaningful difference to what they're running around on the field. There's been no analysis that's meaningful of the injuries that have been sustained on the training pitch versus the on-field, Spurs stadium itself. There's also been a high number of impact injuries this year. I mean, look at the weekend. Romero went down because he was pushed into Kinski, right? We've seen that in other cases. People are sort of holding onto, because they're desperate, onto wild theories. And again, it's like another opportunity to blame Tottenham for this, right? Like Daniel Levy made a bad decision in and this is why I think the bias comes from. Daniel Levy made a bad decision in catering to the NFL by putting into place this retractable pitch. But people are complaining about it without bringing receipts to actually like back up their hypotheses. Something else I'll point to is that recently we played on one of those aforementioned rugby pitches, basically. The field that Atletico have been playing on for months now has been complained about in La Liga. It is far and away not like the usual basically carpet that we're used to seeing teams play on. Have they, on that field, which isn't as hard admittedly, but is massively inconsistent, have Atletico been suffering injury after injury? I'm not sure they have. So to look in on ourselves and say, well, it must be this thing we've done. It must be this thing that the organization of Spurs has done, and that was bad. I feel like is just is finger pointing without thoroughly researching it. This feels like an ideal topic for something like The Lab or Also Spurs to cover. Maybe they have. I haven't seen it as far as I'm aware, to get on turf experts, groundskeepers, to talk about field hardness and the construction of these pitches, and also sports scientists, because from the half an hour of Googling I did, it seems to be inconsistent. There doesn't seem to be either a good methodology for measuring hardness, even if you could. I don't think you can predict hardness based upon how the field is put together in a meaningful way. You could guess, but it's still that. It's a guess. There's information on pure artificial turf versus grass, but even that is inconclusive as to whether there's a bias in injuries on one or the other. So I think that's an issue. People are ignoring like the Occam's razor here, the most obvious answer, which is we have an insufficiently built squad. More on this in a minute. An insufficiently built squad to compensate for the injuries when they come. Right? So we have some injuries, we lose players in positions, people have to work harder, they have to run more minutes, and we're in a situation where the Premier League is so physical that's where the injuries are, in my opinion, coming from. It's pretty simple. Why overcomplicate it other than to fill, the airwaves and, take up valuable column inches online, virtual column inches? Like, why get into these conspiracy theories when you're not an expert on them? Use your own eyes. There are players on the field. They are working hard. You may not think they are, but they're working much harder than than I think we give them credit for. They are desperate. They are making, desperate decisions with their bodies. And they are humans, after all. They are fallible humans with injury records that are getting worse by the day. So I didn't buy it. We also saw bad refereeing on Sunday morning for me here in America. Sunday afternoon for you Brits close to the action in London. And most of it centered on Sunderland's Brobby. He had that obvious push on Romero, which I'm not going to relitigate. You either have decided that it was a yellow card offence and he should have had other yellows throughout the game, or should have been a red because of context. Like, I don't know enough about refereeing. I do feel like, yes, there is some context that comes into play with him. There was the penalty call that was chalked off, and then what happened afterwards, there was a drop ball, and we've seen bad refereeing, inconsistent refereeing throughout the season affecting Spurs. Xavi's tackle against Liverpool getting sent off. People have been talking about how Romero gets talked about in the press. Again, more on that in a moment. And how that affects how referees, actually consider and view his game. But again, I feel like there's sort of something being ignored here that's not being ignored, but being ignored by the referees. Like, I think that there are some problems here. I think that the refs maybe are relying upon VAR too much. And this is something that we see in medical science, where these AI tools and robots and things are. There are concerns about de-skilling in surgeons or in clinicians in terms of diagnostics, or their hands actually completing complex neurosurgery, but also a lower situational awareness leading to errors in medicine. And I can see a direct parallel there with the increase of tools in refereeing, the kind of raw characteristics you need to assess situations in real time very quickly, which are complicated. Are being taken away to a certain extent. The ability to practice those has been taken away by referees. So these inconsistencies are happening. Also, I'm old enough and ugly enough to remember that inconsistencies in reffing has been an issue for decades. Is it worse? I don't know. The quantification of how you figure out refereeing getting worse is so complex, because you need to do referee by referee across games, across years, trying to find like-for-like comparisons. And I don't know if you can do it. But there's this thing called Polyany's paradox, and it's kind of the idea that we know more than we can tell. There's this kind of tacit knowledge or intuitive skill, something like face recognition or riding a bike, that we can't necessarily put into words or put down on paper. And that's kind of the same with situational awareness in refereeing, and that comes back into this practice of it and that sort of strengthening that muscle. There's been talk of conspiracies here too. The idea that Spurs are refereed differently to other teams. And part of that conspiracy theory blows my mind, which is the idea that this is on purpose, that it's somehow being manipulated by the Premier League or EFL or the Referees Association, PGMOL. And I don't understand what would be the point. What do they benefit from that? I think it's a strange thing to point at, and again, is just kind of blaming institutions, which, go ahead, whatever. There's also this idea that we're too nice, that we don't challenge decisions enough. I mean, maybe the players are just kind of reacting to how they're being treated. Maybe there is something to it. Maybe the players are responding to it, and they're concerned about picking up a yellow. Especially if the referees are giving off vibes that they don't want to take any grief. But I've seen the tackles per foul data, and I know that there are no penalties being awarded to Spurs this year. Historical data regarding cards and penalties would need to be considered. This comes back to what I was saying earlier about assessing referees to really say whether this is true or not. But if you look at this year, Villa have the same record as us. No penalties awarded, 2 penalties against in the Premier League. Chelsea and Brighton and Hove Albion, God, I don't think I've ever called Brighton that in my life. Anyway, has the same yellows per game record as us, 2.5 per game. 0.21 yellow cards per foul as well for Chelsea and Brighton. 0.21 yellow cards per foul for Brighton, 0.23 for Chelsea, 0.2 for Sunderland. I think it's like 0.19 or 0.2 or something for us. Like, we're not substantially different in yellow cards per game, yellow cards per foul, and penalties being awarded to teams who are performing much, much better than us. And I think, again, that's the issue here. We're not offering enough. Windy talked about this on the Extra Inch this week. We offer nothing going forward to offset these issues. So these decisions that are going against us seem worse. They seem more impactful. And I think that even more so when you're at the top end of the table and you're talking about qualifying for the Champions League versus qualifying for Europe, it feels, as a fan, substantially different to possibly losing your Premier League status entirely. It is so much worse to be on the arse end of a decision when you could go down than you just might pick up an extra few, 10 million pounds across the season, or players might want to come and play for you. You've always got next year in that case. If you go down, God knows how long it could be. So the stakes are much higher. So which is, I think causing some people to point at the referees and really get into it. And again, hold them accountable. The red clubs do this fine, but let's acknowledge that we're not making our own luck here. Coming back to Romero and him being refereed, there's this concept that he gets yellowed and reds more often than other. Actually, you know what? No, I'm going to loop back real quick. There was a stat today that Chelsea have had 10 red cards, which is the most in the league and more than us. So again, if we were getting more yellows per game, wouldn't you? And that was like a refereeing bias. Wouldn't they also be giving us more reds? I don't know. I don't buy it. Anyway, Romero, the red card magnet. There's this punditry-led narrative about him. Same as there was against Vicario and being weak on corners, the Spursy thing, him being reckless, him deserving of yellow cards and things, Romero. And I think there's a little bit of truth to this. You don't live in a vacuum as a football club. There are the exposures that players, both on our team and others, fans, giving their gut reactions to situations. But also referees, they don't live in this kind of hermetically sealed location away from all media during the week. But again, Gary Neville complaining about us and talking about us being weak and Spursy and stuff, and these narratives potentially influencing referees or influencing players to come to us, like, I get it. But if the players do their job, they give these guys less material to work with. Admittedly, it's, potentially going to affect that 4th versus 5th thing that I just talked about. But, all of this comes down to, if you do your job on the pitch, people are going to be talking more positively about you than negative. And if they already have those pre-existing biases, the media is filled with ex-Arsenal, ex-Chelsea, ex-Liverpool, whoever. There's a dearth of Tottenham pundits out there. Then you're just going to give them, stuff that they can sink their teeth into. It's like dealing with a bully. Like, how many times have our parents told us, don't rise to it, type of thing. There's player confidence. There's the sense of bonding between them has been questioned. We talked about body language, about Mickey especially this year. I've pushed back on that, thinking, well, I would look like shit too if I was playing in the Spurs team. The bonding is an interesting idea. I think we saw some of that in the Tudor, where he took him out for, I think it was like a meal in a Greek restaurant. So you can see they've been trying to do it. Crackers on Last Word on Spurs suggested that they go out for a booze, go out on the lash to try and lift their spirits. I'm not sure if that would help with the injuries or with their ability to train, but I don't know. Maybe there's something in it. And there's this idea that in terms of confidence, the yips, the other Y word, that the players are showing, that one win could just kickstart the season. And we've been saying that for months. But, maybe it's too true. Maybe we'll see a win soon. I hope it's soon. And we will get those points that we need to stay up. Knock on wood. There's a sense of leadership. Coming back to Romero again, him as a leader has been criticized, as was Son Heung-min last season. And there's this idea of, especially in the British sort of psyche, that you need to be a blood and guts, in your face type of captain, and any other type of leadership style, especially if you've got a continental in charge, then it's not going to be enough, and these guys need to be roaring like Michael Dawson. These people completely or misrepresent that type of captaincy and leadership, because maybe that's all they know, maybe that's all they value, but that does seem to be a recurring theme. And this was picked up in Romero's response to the weekend, to his injury. He was crying, he was being consoled. People were questioning whether or not this would have an impact on his teammates and bring them down, when he should have been walking off and saying, "Come on, lads, go get it." You're like, maybe there's a truth to that. Yeah, maybe it could have helped, but it happened. We don't know why he was crying. People have, for a long time, and I think there's a grain of truth in it, that Romero prefers to play for Argentina than Spurs. Frankly, I can't blame him. But he is the captain, and maybe there is a leadership there. There's a strength that he needs to project in that moment, which is different to maybe how he is respected around the dressing room and in the training ground. His impulsiveness and petulance has also been criticized. And I thought this was an interesting concept shared by somebody on Last Word on Spurs or another pod, which was that Romero might be a perfect deputy, as we saw last season, when he could step up and was huge in the Europa League final. Maybe he's only a when the going is good type of captain. I don't know, but I think that's an interesting idea, because some people are better, support than they are the person out front. I don't know. I think that he got the captaincy for reasons that we don't fully understand, but also because he's kind of our best player and he's senior and we have such a young team. He has a ton of experience that helped him, pick it up. Maybe. Another thing we saw on the weekend was mistakes made by managers, and, it's Roberto De Zerbi's first game and his hands are tied on what he can do. But people criticize his starting 11, the timing of his subs, and this has been, this is like fan 101, right? We saw this under Frank and Tudor, criticisms of their decision making, especially Tudor playing people out of position. But this comes into squad composition. So I think there's a truth here. I don't think that people are necessarily blaming De Zerbi for the loss or anything like that, but they're sort of questioning whether or not he could have done more to change the game. But it all comes down to squad composition, which has been incredibly consistent. There's no star players is something that I've heard time and again. In theory, there should be some. Like Romero should be a star player on paper. He hasn't, for some, performed to his level this year. I think that him and a lot of our players have retreated further to their floor than their ceiling. he's hit that ceiling at times, scored goals, but I think that the desperation that's permeating through the squad is affecting their levels. We saw with Xavi, again, a sort of huge summer signing. He wasn't picked again. Another coach isn't picking him. What is it? Is it his resting sad boy face? Is it how he trains? Is there an attitude issue? Is it his physicality in the Premier League? Is it his speed of decision making? But regardless, he was benched, and he's kind of the best we've got in that creative midfield position. He didn't get on the pitch at all. He was, Randall Kolo Muani was favoured over him on the right. Conor Gallagher, who I've heard him being called the worst transfer of all time. I think it was James Moore on The View from the Lane who said that. Not in terms of his individual quality, but the sort of timing and situation into which he was bought and whether the money could have been better spent. And I agree with this. He hasn't been great, Xavi. Romero hasn't been great. But things like organisation, desire, I dare say, these things can compensate. It's the kind of the gestalt, everything coming together, which matters a lot in team sports. Not the individual qualities themselves. You could have 11 of the best players of all time, that's fine. But if they're all wingers, they're not going to win a game. I said on Blue Sky that I don't think that one star player, if you could pick them out of history and get them in the TARDIS, bring them into the modern day and throw them into the Spurs squad, whether they would save us. People have talked about, and people rightfully push back on me, they have, that's fine, that maybe the marginal gains would be enough. Too many intangibles, in my opinion. There's too many leaks for us to plug them all with one person. The closest that I could agree with was Kane, because of his ability to both link up play and also just take those chances that that we need to maybe pick up a point or two. That one I think is the most merit, and maybe someone like Bale, just somebody who could create something out of absolutely nothing. But there were just way too many issues across the field. Even if, as I've heard, this is another point, that these players aren't good enough. Again, I push back on this. I think there are issues with them. They are Premier League standard players. Whether they are Premier League standard players together is a different matter. There was an excellent article in ESPN about the technical deficiencies of our squad and their inability to pick a pass and how they've been chosen for their physicality over all else, it seems like. And I think that there's truth to the players not being good enough in certain ways, but very good in others. It's almost like we've tried to build a squad that's like Germany in the 2000s, the sort of physical, hard running, probably beat you up kind of person, but they had such a high technical floor that they could come together and it was and be amongst the best in the world. We've hoped that some kids would be able to grow into that, and I just don't think it's been. I just think that we rolled the dice on a gamble, and it hasn't paid off, or at the very least, it hasn't paid off yet, and we are in trouble. People have been calling for weeks now for the kids to be played, like Luca Williams-Barnett, Janai Beifeld, loads of other people whose names I've forgotten already, and there's this recurring theme in the desperation of Spurs fans to point at one thing and say, this will save us. These kids will save us. Somebody with no Premier League experience could come in and do a job out of position, or they're scoring goals for the under-16s. That's fine. We never should have let Mikey Moore go. All these things are untestable without them getting onto the field to give you the data. But I'm very wary of pinning hopes on children who we have no idea how they would interact with men, essentially, or with this team, this broken team. I don't believe that they're going to be able to do it. There are questions about whether they could have been used earlier in the season, but now I don't buy it. Fan support. There's been a lot of talk about the Forest game where we came out and showed on the streets a massive display of support for the team. It was amazing. I think as much as anything else, we needed that as fans to get out and do it. But there's a question about whether or not that piled more pressure on these young men who are already experiencing a type of pressure that many of us will never experience in our lives. The public humiliation of where they are, the tens of thousands of people getting on their backs every week. And, there's this 12th man idea that fans can get behind and be the difference maker in games. And again, that might be true. I think it's overblown when we're up at the right end of the table. But it might be a factor when you're struggling, maybe. That it's the negative pressure is not equal to positive pressure. But there has been pressure. I think that the fans have been under a tremendous amount of stress, and we have lost our backsides a lot, but not without cause. I think that Thomas Frank criticizing us, some of the stupidity that we've experienced this year from people like himself. That Arsenal Cup is still getting mentioned. There's been a lot of infighting and bad blood around Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and White Hart Lane. But I do wonder how our reactions in this moment are compared to those who are more experienced relegation adjacent fan bases, those who have been promoted, those who in recent memory have been relegated. And I think this would be an interesting idea to talk about in a future episode. Gareth Dace on Blue Sky asked a question about what it is that's our strongest motivating factor to our negative reaction, understandable and correct negative reaction to being relegated. So that is something I think I'll come back to at some point. But yeah, right now in this moment, ignore everything that happened before. How are we reacting to other relegation teams in previous years? Obviously, Forest and West Ham are feeling great because they've pulled themselves out. But that's curious to me. And finally, I think that this last point is the one that resonates most strongly with me as a motivating factor for basically everything else that I've talked about. The squad composition, the manager choices, the fan sentiment, or whatever else. And that's leadership at the club. That's Vinay Venkatesham as CEO. That's Johan Lange as sporting director. That's ENIC as owners. That's Fabio Paratici as whatever the hell he was. That's Daniel Levy as the kind of baron over everything at Spurs, but who had his fingers on everything, keeping together and creating a system that relied upon him so strongly. I talked already about that leadership at length on this pod, but I think that if you have good leadership, these other issues don't happen. You make good sporting decisions. I referenced that ESPN article a moment ago. You make good decisions about how you spend your money, where you spend your money, what you do, how you treat your fans. You make decisions about when you make decisions. Hey, sacking Thomas Frank soon enough. And similar to this thing with the kids, or signing them and then being our saviors, or Mikey Moore, or players coming back and being the difference maker like Kudus or something. There's this tendency amongst fans to want what you can't have, and that's changed on Daniel Levy. There's this persistent narrative that we wouldn't be here if Daniel Levy was in charge. He would have sacked Frank sooner. He would have bought more players than Conor Gallagher. But again, that might be true. I think there's a truth to it. It's something that I do substantially buy into. But he also created this mess. We were told that Venkatesham was a mate of his. He oversaw the hiring of Johan Lange, Fabio Paratici, the squad composition, creating an organization that needs him. But it goes a layer above that, because we don't know what ENIC and the Lewis's constraints are upon him. I won't harp on about leadership, but it's difficult in the moment to remember the very high level sort of strongest factors when you see people run around on the pitch and they're falling over or conceding goals or getting sent off. Like your point, and that's going to be the thing that dominates the week. And you can't keep going on and on about the same topic, but it is always there. There's a certain amount of fatigue with it, though, to keep saying it, to keep raising the issue, and we'll see. Again, maybe the grass won't be greener. Who knows? But right now, that grass is dying. But I think as you can hear as I talk, that all of these factors and conspiracy theories and sort of ideas about why we are where we are almost a mesh. I don't think you can point to any one thing and say, this is exactly why we're in the trouble we're in. There's too many intangibles, too many unquantifiable things. But you can hear that, squad composition drives injuries and drives manager mistakes. And manager mistakes drive losses. And, manager mistakes drive luck. And then that influences fan support. But then fan support loops back because the players feel pressure. Like, it's an absolute omni-shambles. Everything has gone wrong. I do wonder, though, if there was one thing that you could point at and understand more than anything else, whether that would make a big difference in how we feel in this moment. Like if the Lewises went bankrupt and you could say, wow, right? Like that's what it is. Or I don't know, something else like a complete manager cock-up. If it had only been Frank's decisions and the players were fit and we were happy with leadership otherwise, like I do wonder if just having one single thing that you could understand would lessen the blow in a way, like because that would give you confidence that like, okay, we could go down, but we know why. We can correct that one issue and then start again. Here, and this has been appealing to some people, is that we have too many things that we have to correct, and there's this unknowable future and lack of trust in the higher ups at Spurs to correct players, to make the fans feel better, to support Roberto De Zerbi so he doesn't make mistakes, to pressure the referees, to change the narrative about Spurs in with an injection of change. I don't think that we have that confidence. So let's wrap up. I talked a lot today. The common theme, unsurprisingly, is the players. Not as individuals, but as to the puzzle as it fits together. We have too many edge pieces. I don't know. Too many players in some positions, too few in others, too similar in some, and all of that. I think if you it's not one issue, but I am going to point finger at Johan Lange here. I think that his what is it, the Peter principle? He's been promoted above his abilities. Stu on CADS reminded me of that idea. But the squad you assemble is the thing that matters. We see this with a team like Chelsea, right? They've mostly been consistent throughout the years because they've assembled just a talented squad. They've put the money in, and like it doesn't matter if you change the captain or the manager or whatever. Like you've made it such that your floor, the lowest point you can probably go to, is pretty high because the players will bail you out. And maybe this is a lingering narrative from the days of, John Terry, when essentially the players carried them through to a Champions League win, which fucked over Spurs. But that's by the by. What we've done is we've been arrogant as a football club, and we've let all of these issues creep in and become bigger and bigger and bigger. Our hubris has been our undoing. So we don't know what comes next. There's 6 cup finals: Brighton, Wolves, Leeds, Villa, Chelsea, Everton. Sadly, we haven't got a great track record in cup finals, but something massive has to happen. And if it does, it's quite possibly one of the sort of not best, but most impactful moments in our history. One of those sliding door moments about whether we go down or stay up. And either one could be the thing that we need. Staying up and making good decisions moving forward could be fine. Maybe it's going down and clearing out players who don't want to be here, sending a lightning bolt through leadership. I don't know, but I'm going to save my relegation debrief for when and if it happens. I don't think you guys who listen need to hear the other podcasts that you tune into talking about fear-mongering, about relegation, about money, about players who might leave, who might stay, who we might sign, what changes are going to happen at the football club. I don't want to get into that too deeply until it's a reality. Mostly for my own sanity, but also just for the sake of the content I produce. I like it to keep it fresh. So thanks for sticking to the end if you've made it all the way through. We're going into nearly an hour, and it has been a sort of good experience again. I like these deep dives into the whys and ifs and hows of Tottenham Hotspur. Just stay calm. There's nothing we can do to affect this situation beyond the fan support aspect. But most of the people listening to this probably aren't match-going fans. The minority might be. But get out there and do your part. Try to combat misinformation when you see it, or ask for evidence, Engage with people about why they think what they do, Try to, maybe they've got information that might be helpful if they are an expert in sports science or in something else, in player mentality. I don't know, whatever, business, or just if somebody is making a claim, ask yourself: does this make sense? And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Some of these conspiracy theories around Spurs just create a kind of a negative atmosphere. And that's all they are, theories. They're not realities necessarily. Conspiracy realities. So thanks for listening. Keep a level head. You'll be fine. Spurs may not be, but you'll be fine. As I say every week, keep in touch. Keep sharing the podcast like you have been. Keep giving me feedback. Like I said, the Roberto De Zerbi episode was really it was like a really nice reaction from people. It helped some people. It helped in terms of considering angles they hadn't thought of, in terms of processing their own experiences, but also as an opportunity to challenge. So thanks for that, and I hope the same can be true here. I'm probably going to get a comment on Spotify well, actually, here's this paper from 2005 that says that if you run on retractable pitches, that you have a 5% increase in hamstring injuries. I don't know. I don't care. Whatever. Thank you for sharing. Stay in touch at poddinhampodspur.bsky.social over on the Blue Skies. You can email me at my Gmail, poddinhampodspur@gmail.com, and keep listening to Spurs podcasts and keep making them too. Koi.
Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.